So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. A is not 1. If A is not 1, the very first thing you need to do is you need to look for a GCF. So looking for a GCF, is there any number that you can think of that you can divide 4, 19, and 5? There is no number that I can think of that divides 4, 19, and 5. So there is no number GCF. They do not all share a common variable, so there is no variable GCF. So my GCF is just a 1, which means now I need to move on and I need to see if A allows me to use the area model or if I can use the trick method I found. A is not 1. If A is not 1, then you have to use the area model. So I have to identify A, identify B, and identify C. Now the purpose of using the area model is so that we could rewrite this middle term as 2 separate terms. So we'll then have 4 terms for the area model. So the 4x squared is going to stay as the 4x squared. The minus 5 is going to stay as the minus 5. We're looking at how could we rewrite minus 19x so we have 4 terms. We get that by doing the A times C, somebody better add up to B list. So looking at my numbers, A times C, 4 times negative 5 is a negative 20. And then my B is a negative 19. I need to find all the ways to multiply to get negative 20. So I know either the 1 is the negative or the 20 would have been the negative. Because both of these multiply to give me negative 20. Negative 1 plus 20 would have given me 19. 1 with a negative 20 would have given me a negative 19, which is the number that we were looking for. So the 2 numbers we are going to use are a positive 1, and it's an x because we were splitting the x's, and a minus 20x. So now that our polynomial has 4 terms, we are allowed to use the area model. So looking in the top, 4 and 1 can't divide any of those by the same number, but x squared and x have a GCF of x. So I just have an x out here. X times somebody needs to give me 4x squared. X times 4x is going to give me 4x squared. X times 1 will give me my 1x. 1 times a negative 5 will give me the negative 5. Negative 5 times 4x will give me the negative 20x. So I found no GCF, but my area model will tell me the 2 sides. So x minus 5 and a 4x plus 1. So these 2 parentheses are your factors. So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. I see that I have 3 terms. First thing I need to look at is A1. A is not 1. So if A is not 1, I need to go and find a GCF. Very first GCF I know I have to pull out. I have to factor out a negative 1 because you cannot have a negative in the front term. So first I'm going to factor out my negative 1, which means everybody in here gets divided by a negative. So I have 5m to the third minus 6m squared plus m. So now that I factored out the negative 1, I need to see, is there a GCF at all in the rest of the problem? So looking at my GCF, I have 5m to the third, negative 6m squared, and m. Remember, the only number legally allowed to be negative is a 1. These are my prime factorization lists. So I need to look for a GCF. So I see that I have an m in common in all of them, so I'm going to write an m, and there's nothing else there. So I already had a negative 1 factored out. Now I'm going to factor out an additional m. So I'm going to divide all of these by m, or I'm going to look to see what my leftovers were. So I have 5m squared minus 6m plus 1. M divided by my new m is 1. There was no leftovers here. M times 1 is technically m. Every list has something written here. So if you ran out of anything in the list, that meant your leftover was a 1 that you had to have there. So now this is my new polynomial. If I already factored out a negative 1, and now I'm actually factoring out an m, I should have at the very beginning factored out a negative m, because negative 1 times m is a negative m. So that is actually my GCF, negative m. I just did it in 2 chunks instead of 1. So now this is what I need to look at. A is not 1. Since A is not 1, that meant that I have to use the area model. So A is 5, B is negative 6, and C is 1. And I need to do my A times C, somebody better add up to B list. B is a negative 6. A of 5 times C of 1 is 5. So all the ways to multiply to get 5. I know 1 times 5 will multiply to give me 5, but when I add these, I get a 6. I needed a negative 6. So what about negative 1 times negative 5? They multiply together to get 5, and when I add them, I do get the negative 6 that I needed. So the whole reason for doing this is because we had to use the area model, which meant I needed to split this middle term up. I'm going to split this middle term up using the two values that I just found. So I still have my minus m. Cannot forget your GCF. I still have a 5m squared. Instead of a minus 6m, I now have a minus 1m and a minus 5m. I rewrote the minus 6m as negative 1m minus 5m. And you still have this plus 1. Now that we have 4 terms in here, we are allowed to use our area model. So looking in the top, 5 and negative 1 do not have a factor in common. M squared and m have an m in common. So as soon as I have 1, I'm going to multiply it to rest. M times 5m is going to give me the 5m squared. M times a negative 1 will give me the negative 1m. Negative 1 times negative 1 will give me the positive 1. Negative 1 times 5m gives me the negative 5m. So now that I've done my area model, our final answer always starts with the GCF first, and then we need to put the 2 parentheses that our area model gave us. So this is m minus 1, and that is 5m minus 1. So these came from the area model. And this right here is your final answer, and you're done. So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. I see that I have 3 terms, and a is not 1. So the very first thing I need to do is I need to look for a GCF. What number can divide 6, negative 21, and 5? I know that 3 can divide all of those, and they have no common variable. So my GCF is going to be a 3, which means I'm going to divide everybody by that 3. So 6x squared divided by 3 is a 2x squared. Negative 21x divided by 3 is a minus 7x. Positive 15 divided by 3 is a positive 5. If you struggle with the division, then you should make your lists and see what your leftovers are. So this right here is now the polynomial that I need to look at. Because a is not 1, that meant that I needed to use the area model so that I could rewrite it. And this middle term right here is going to get split into 2 parts. So I have my a as a 2, my b as a minus 7, and my c as a 5. So my a times c, somebody better add up to b list. So a of 2 times c of 5, I have 10, and somebody better add up to negative 7. 1 times 10 multiply to give me 10, but when I add them I get 11. That didn't work. Negative 1 times negative 10 multiply to give me 10, but when I add them together I get negative 11. Didn't work. It's closer, but didn't work. So ones didn't work, try 2's. 2 times 5 multiply to give me 10, but when I add them I get 7. Negative 2 times a negative 5 multiply together to give me 10. When I add them I get a negative 7. I needed a negative 7, which meant these 2 numbers are the numbers that I'm going to use to split this up. So you have to start with the GCF. You cannot forget your GCF. I still had a 2x squared. Instead of minus 7x, I'm going to write a minus 2x and a minus 5x. And then I still have this plus 5. Now my polynomial has 4 terms, which means now I can actually use my area model. So looking at the top, the GCF between 2 and negative 2 is a 2. X squared and x is an x. So my GCF for the top row is 2x. Now I'm just going to go around and multiply the rest of it. 2x times x gives me 2x squared. 2x times a negative 1 gives me the negative 2. Negative 1 times a negative 5 gives me the positive 5. Negative 5 times x gives me the negative 5x. So I found my area model. So do not forget about your GCF. My GCF was the 3. And then the area model tells me my new parentheses. This is 2x minus 5. And this is an x minus 1. And these came from the area model. And so this right here is my final answer, and I'm done. So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. I see that I have 3 terms, and a is not 1. So the very first thing that you have to do, if a is not 1, you have to find a GCF. Is there any number that divides 6, 1, and negative 12? There is no number that will divide all of those evenly. So I have no number GCF. Is there a variable that they all share? Well, this doesn't even have a variable. So no, there is no variable they all share. So my GCF is just a 1. So that means that this is the smallest my polynomial is ever going to get. So now I just need to factor it. A not being 1 means that we have to use the area model. And we're going to use the area model so we can figure out what two terms to rewrite a plus 1x as. So we had to identify A, which is 6, B, which is 1, and C, which is a negative 12. So we can do our A times C, somebody better add up to B, list. So 6 times negative 12 gives me my negative 72, and somebody has to add up to be 1. So negative 72, which meant one of my numbers had to be negative. We start with ones. So negative 1 times 72 does multiply to give me negative 72, but when I add them together, I get 71, not the number that I wanted. So now then try 2's. So negative 2 times 36. Multiply these together, I do get a negative 72, but when I add these together, I get a 34. That didn't work. 1 didn't work, 2 didn't work, so try 3. Negative 3 times 24. They multiply to give me negative 72, but when I add them, I get a 21. 1's didn't work, 2's didn't work, 3's didn't work, so now I need to try 4. Negative 4 times 18 gives me a negative 72, but when I add these together, I get 14. I'm getting closer, but it's still not the answer. So 1's didn't work, 2's didn't work, 3's didn't work, 4's didn't work. Next, try 5. Nothing times 5 will give me a negative 72, so no. Then 6. Negative 6 times 12 multiply together to give me a negative 72. And when I add these, I do get a 6. Not the one that I needed. Try 7's. Nothing times 7 will give me 72. So that doesn't work. So then 8's. Negative 8 times 9 does multiply together to give me negative 72. When I add these, I do get a 1. 1 is the number that I needed, which meant these are the two numbers that I'm going to rewrite plus 1x as. So I still have my 6x squared. I now have a minus 8x and a plus 9x. That's what I chose to rewrite it as. And then this is a minus 12. So now that I have 4 terms, I get to use my area model. And I need to figure out what is the GCF for the top. 6 and negative 8 can both be divided by the largest number of 2. X squared and x both have a factor of x in common. So the GCF for the top is 2x. 2x times a 3x will give me a 6x squared. 2x times a negative 4 will give me the negative 8x. Negative 4 times 3 will give me the negative 12x. 3 times 3x will give me the 9x. I did not have a GCF, so all I have are the 2 parentheses that come from my area model. And then I am done.